Hey guys, tonight we wander back into the surprisingly busy and occasionally absurd daily life of Paleolithic people to answer a question that sounds simple until you really sit with it. What did our cave-dwelling ancestors actually do all day? As it turns out, it was rather more than a highlight reel of rock smashing and dramatic fire discovery moments. If you find yourself enjoying these quiet late-night wanders through the past, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps the channel keep going, though only ever do that if this is the sort of thing you truly enjoy. And whenever you have a spare thought, tell me down in the comments where in the world you happen to be tuning in from and what the hour is where you are. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from so many different corners of the map. With that said, let us wander back into the deep past. The average day for a Paleolithic person tended to begin at dawn, or a little before it, depending on how loudly the wind was carrying on, or whether somebody nearby had started coughing again in the dark. Most people slept on animal hides, or simply on the packed earth itself, occasionally softened by a scattering of dried grass or a heap of leaves for a bit of padding. You would almost always sleep close to a fire, not for the atmosphere but for warmth, and for the way flames kept insects and hungry animals at a respectful distance. Bedding down apart from the group was not really a sensible choice, not unless you fancied waking up with a foot fewer than you went to sleep with, so people slept in small, tightly packed clusters, families, extended families, and whatever assortment of other souls made up the local band. Privacy, in any form we would recognize, simply did not exist, and everyone heard everything, all night long. The very first task after waking was to check on the fire. If it had gone out during the night, someone had the unglamorous job of coaxing it back to life, which could demand time, patience, and a great deal of stubborn rubbing of sticks together. And if the morning air was cold, which, depending on the season, it very often was, then the whole group would remain thoroughly irritable until those first flames returned. Next you might cast an eye over your tools and weapons, the spears, the knives, the scrapers, anything at all that could serve for hunting or defense. These implements had to be kept in working order at all times, because to lose your tools was to lose your ability to gather food, to protect yourself, or to butcher meat and prepare hides. Some members of the group had a far surer hand at this craft than others, and it was not unusual to borrow a finer piece of gear from a more skilled neighbour, though they would almost certainly expect something in return. Children were, as a rule, the first to start making noise. They would begin stirring and shuffling about, hunting for something to eat or something to do, and frequently both at once. The adults would rise more slowly and set about the business of the day, which might mean fetching water, inspecting the traps set nearby, or heading out to read the ground for fresh signs of animal movement. Nobody had the luxury of easing gradually into the morning. There was simply no time for it. The daily aim was blunt and unchanging: stay warm, find food, and avoid injury. If you woke up whole and unbroken, if your fire was still glowing, and if nothing outside looked like an immediate threat, then you were already comfortably ahead of the game. In the Paleolithic era, personal hygiene certainly existed, just not in any form we would easily recognize today. Cleanliness was a practical matter, not a question of appearance. You cleaned yourself when the grime began to interfere with living, or when the smell had become a problem the whole group could no longer ignore. Bathing did happen, but it leaned heavily on the season and the landscape. If a stream ran nearby, people washed in it whenever the water was not painfully cold. Otherwise, getting clean might mean wiping the dirt away with handfuls of leaves, scouring the skin with sand, or, on rare and luxurious occasions, rubbing it down with animal fat. That is right. Fat could serve as a kind of scrub, which sounds peculiar until you remember it also helped hold in warmth and kept some insects at bay. Teeth were a rather different affair. There were no toothbrushes, of course, but some people chewed on fibrous sticks or splinters of bone to work their teeth clean. Dental wear was extremely common, especially given a diet of tough meat, coarse unprocessed grains, and the fine grit of sand particles that found their way into food from grinding stones. Cave dwellers did not brush, but then again they never ate candy, so cavities as we know them were genuinely rare. Losing a tooth to injury or sheer wear, however, was another story and a far more frequent misfortune. Hair care was kept to the barest minimum. Hair was usually worn long, tied back out of the way, or simply left to its own devices. Lice were a constant companion. Some groups smeared on ash, dirt, or animal oils to beat back the infestations, while others relied on the timeless and only partly effective method of scratching a great deal and hoping the problem sorted itself out. There is also evidence from later prehistoric periods of primitive combs and grooming tools, so some genuine effort was eventually made. Clothing did little to improve the situation. Animal hides were not breathable, and they were seldom washed. If a garment began to reek, people either grew accustomed to it or quietly blamed whoever happened to be sitting nearest the fire. Feet were mostly bare or wrapped in simple hide shoes bound around the ankle, so the smell inside a prehistoric cave was a distinctive thing indeed. But here comes the surprising part. Despite the total absence of soap or showers, early humans adapted remarkably well. Their immune systems were robust, and their communities understood just enough about cleanliness to steer clear of serious outbreaks. In truth, most people probably smelled about the same as one another, so nobody particularly noticed. Unless you did something genuinely extreme, like rolling in a dead animal, which, by the way, some people deliberately did as a form of camouflage before a hunt. There was no fixed hour for eating. If the previous night's hunt had failed, or the food had already been eaten or pilfered by some clever raccoon-like creature with ambition, then breakfast meant foraging, digging for roots, checking the nearby berry bushes, or scanning the horizon for edible plants that had not already been claimed. People ate when they could, whatever they could, and only if anything happened to be left over from the day before. If you woke to find a strip of dried meat still hanging by the embers, then congratulations, you had won the prehistoric lottery. Most mornings, though, did not begin so kindly. By animals or hungry children. The choices shifted with the seasons. Spring offered up greens, summer brought fruit, and winter, more often than not, brought hunger. Protein was a far less reliable prospect. Small creatures such as birds, rabbits, or insects were occasionally caught and eaten whole or roasted over the fire. Insects, in fact, were a dependable source of protein, even if nobody was ever especially thrilled about it. If you stumbled upon a termite mound or a handful of grubs, that might well become the morning meal. They did not taste of much, but at least they did not bite back. Sometimes you would share your find with others, particularly within your own family group. But food was treated as a resource, not as a matter of politeness. If somebody carried breakfast back to camp, it usually meant they were either generous or in charge, or a comfortable mix of both. Water was another pressing priority. Streams, springs, and rivers were the preferred sources, if fortune favoured you. If not, a puddle simply had to do. Boiling water was not yet common practice, so most of it was drunk raw, occasionally accompanied by whatever bacteria came along for the ride, which the gut then either conquered or came to deeply regret. Now and then there might be leftovers from the last great hunt, smoked meat, marrow scooped from cracked open bones, or dried strips of hide that were technically edible with enough determined chewing. Such things were valuable, and people stored them high up, wrapped, or tucked away out of sight, though nothing on earth could truly stop a determined child armed with a stick. So every single morning was a fresh gamble. Perhaps you would turn up a few berries and a half-roasted squirrel. Perhaps you would find nothing at all. Either way, no one ever skipped breakfast on purpose. After breakfast, or after the grim realization that breakfast was not going to happen, the next major task of the day was tool maintenance. Tools were not accessories or luxuries. They were survival equipment, plain and simple. Without a good sharp edge, you could not cut meat, scrape a hide, or defend yourself against much of anything. And so a surprising portion of the day was spent hunched over rocks, striking them against other rocks, patiently trying to coax out just the right shape. Welcome to Paleolithic toolmaking, part genuine craftsmanship, part trial and error, and entirely dependent on not accidentally smashing your own thumb. The raw material of choice was flint, or obsidian, if you were feeling fancy and happened to live within reach of a volcano. These stones fractured in predictable ways, which meant you could flake off keen edges and shape true cutting tools. The basic starter kit included hand axes, scrapers, spearheads, and the ever-popular rock lash to a handle. There was no single tool that did everything. Each one had its own purpose, some for butchering, some for shaping wood, and a few for tasks we still do not entirely understand, though they most likely involved hitting things. Most people fashioned their own tools, but, as with everything else, some were plainly better at it than others. If someone had a real gift for napping perfectly balanced spear points, they earned both respect and a steady stream of requests. Sharpening was a constant chore, since a dull edge was essentially useless, and worse, it was dangerous, liable either to hurt you or to waste your precious time. Stones were ground, flaked, and tested day after day, and yes, this sometimes meant labouring for 2 hours over something that shattered after 2 minutes of use. You did not complain about it. You simply began again from the start. Toolkits were often handed down, traded, or occasionally stolen outright. To lose yours was not merely embarrassing, it landed you in serious trouble, because the moment you had nothing sharp within reach was invariably the moment something with claws decided to appear. Every so often, real creativity took hold. Someone might bind a rock to a stick with animal sinew and proudly call it a hammer. Others discovered the value of bone tools, which were flexible, light, and ideal for delicate work. The very seeds of later technological revolutions, even if the people behind them were mostly just trying to cut something a little faster. Once the tools were ready, and the matter of breakfast, or its absence, had been settled one way or another, it was time to face the main event of the day, the hunt. Hunting in the Paleolithic world was never a solitary pastime. It was a full-team operation, often demanding every able-bodied member of the group, plus that one fellow whose main contribution was shouting useful things like "go left," and that is not a deer. Large animals were the true jackpot. Mammoths, bison, wild horses, anything big enough to feed the whole group for a week was worth the risk. But such creatures were also enormously dangerous. Mammoths did not simply stand about waiting to be speared. They were fast, they were heavy, and they had no patience whatsoever for hairless bipeds armed with pointed sticks. Planning a hunt of that scale took real coordination. Scouts ranged ahead to track the herds, while others prepared traps, pits covered over with branches, natural choke points beside rivers, or, if the group was feeling ambitious and a touch reckless, steep cliffs to drive the animals over. Then came the ambush itself, all yelling, spear throwing, and a great deal of running, with everyone hoping that something large would go down, preferably before anyone in the group did. For smaller game, deer, boar, or even rabbits, the process was more straightforward. Spears, clubs, and well-judged ambushes did the work, and traps and snares helped enormously, especially for hunters working alone or in small parties. Yet even with modest prey, things went wrong all the time. One clumsy step, and suddenly you were chasing a pig through the woods while trying to explain how you very nearly had it. Sometimes the hunting party returned in triumph, dragging back meat, bones, and bragging rights all at once. Other times they came home with nothing but scrapes and excuses. The wind shifted was a firm favourite, and so was blaming whoever had sneezed at the critical moment of the ambush. Meat was never simply food, it was status. The person who delivered the killing blow often earned first pick of the spoils, more respect, and rather fewer chores that evening. Even so, sharing remained common because you needed your group, and burning bridges over a share of meat only led to long, awkward silences around the fire. Hunting, then, was never purely about survival. It was teamwork, calculated risk, and real-time strategy, all carried out while doing one's very best not to be trampled. Not everyone in the Paleolithic world spent their days chasing mammoths. Some people had a far more practical calling, which was finding things that did not fight back. Foraging lacked the drama of the hunt, but it was every bit as essential, and, frankly, it succeeded far more often. You did not always bring down a deer, but the odds were rather good that you would find a berry bush. The foraging crew, frequently made up of women, older adults and children too young to throw a spear without striking a nearby tree, covered a great deal of ground. They searched out edible plants, berries, nuts, roots, seeds, mushrooms, and anything else that did not taste quite like regret. Knowing what was safe to eat came down to experience, to patient trial and error, and, unfortunately, to the occasional funeral. Foragers built up remarkably detailed mental maps of their territory. They remembered which valleys hid the best tubers, which trees dropped the finest nuts, and which plants looked perfectly edible, but most certainly were not. This kind of knowledge was handed down with real care, because the margin for error was thin. Confuse a wholesome root with a poisonous one, and a pleasant afternoon snack could become a genuine crisis. Yet foraging was not always the calm, unhurried task we might picture. There were moments of tension. Gatherers frequently found themselves in quiet competition with the local wildlife, squaring off against birds, squirrels, and sometimes even bears for the same patch of ripe berries. And anyone who reached carelessly toward a hive and disturbed a wasp nest learned a lesson they never willingly repeated. Gathering also demanded a certain talent for doing several things at once. While filling a basket with food, a person might simultaneously be collecting firewood, feathers, strips of bark, or plants known to ease aches and wounds. Children came along on these outings, absorbing the trade by watching and imitating, and now and then trying to eat something they had absolutely no business putting in their mouths. You kept a steady eye on them, tried to count heads, and did all this while quietly debating with a companion over whether a particular mushroom looked a little too strange to trust. Much of the time, the food that was gathered proved more dependable than anything brought back from a hunt. Plants, after all, do not sprint away when approached. Nuts do not fight back. And with good timing, a single day of harvesting could supply the group with several meals, or at the very least keep everyone fed during the long stretches between unsuccessful hunts. In this sense, the foragers were the unsung backbone of the tribe. They were never the loudest members, never the ones performing feats of daring, and they rarely drew a crowd. But on the evenings when the hunting party trudged home with nothing to show for their efforts, it was the gatherers who quietly made sure there was still something to eat. If any single thing made Paleolithic existence even remotely bearable, it was fire. Fire cooked the food, drove back the cold, frightened away lurking predators, and gave people the simple gift of being able to see the ground beneath their feet once the sun had gone. Without it, the odds of making it through the night fell sharply. For that reason, every band lived by one understanding that needed no stating aloud: the fire must never be allowed to die. Someone, usually whoever had drawn the least fortunate task that day, was assigned to tend it. That meant watching the flames, feeding them a steady diet of wood, and reacting quickly whenever the wind shifted or the coals began to sink into a worrying dimness. It was not a role that earned admiration, but it was among the most vital. A person could skip a meal or struggle through a poor day of hunting, but if the fire went out, the whole group had a genuine emergency on its hands. Coaxing a new fire into being from nothing was no small feat. It relied on friction, on tools like fire drills and sticks spun rapidly against dry wood by hand. If your fingers were stiff with cold, or the material was even slightly damp, you might spend the better part of a day waiting and hoping for a single ember to take pity on you. This is exactly why so many groups did everything they could to keep one flame burning at all times, even as they packed up and moved to a new camp. In certain cases, a person would carry a glowing coal, cushioned in moss or bark, nursing that small heat along the entire journey. That individual had one responsibility, and the weight of it was very real indeed. Gathering fuel was part of the arrangement too. Dry wood, kindling, dried animal dung, anything that would burn without violently protesting counted as acceptable. Children often pitched in, though they occasionally returned proudly bearing things that merely looked flammable, such as sodden logs or mushrooms still half buried in earth. Keeping the fire alive also carried a social dimension. The fire sat at the very centre of camp life. People gathered around it to sit, to share meals, to swap stories, and to bicker good-naturedly over whose turn it was to stand watch. In a way, the fire pit was the earliest version of a living room, with one significant difference. If the person on duty dozed off, the consequences could be fatal for everyone. Nobody was ever congratulated for successfully keeping the flames going. But if those flames died, there were no acceptable excuses, only a ring of irritated faces and the unspoken understanding that someone would be spending the evening trying to strike fresh sparks in the dark. Despite what many people assume, not every prehistoric human lived inside a cave. Caves were wonderful when you could find one, offering natural shelter, protection from the wind, and sturdy walls that came already built. But they were not always on offer, especially when rival groups or wild animals had already moved in. So, as resourceful humans have always done, early people set about building homes of their own, more or less. Construction in the Paleolithic was never a matter of style. There were no drawings to follow, no architects to consult, and certainly no committees to satisfy. The aim was refreshingly simple: keep the weather outside and the people inside. In regions without usable caves, families likely raised huts and shelters from wood, bone, mud, grass, and whatever else lay within reach. A frame of branches or even mammoth ribs would be bound together with animal sinew or tough vines, then draped with hides, layered with bark, or sealed with packed earth. The finished product was a lopsided affair that leaked only slightly less than standing out in the open would have. Building was very much a shared undertaking. One person steadied the sticks, another handled the tying, and a third stood nearby projecting an air of expertise they did not actually possess. If the whole thing sagged and collapsed midway through, no one was especially shocked. You simply gathered the pieces and began again, this time with a few reinforcing sticks added for good measure. The weather remained a constant adversary. Rain churned dirt floors into shallow bogs. Wind could tear hide coverings loose as though nature had opinions about the decor. Heavy snow could flatten an entire shelter that had not been properly braced. This is why some groups maintained two kinds of dwellings: light, disposable summer huts that could be left behind without a second thought, and sturdier winter shelters meant to endure long, bleak seasons of cold. Insulation was a genuine luxury. If fortune smiled, hides lined both the walls and the floor. If it did not, you simply wore more layers and grumbled about it. The fire held its place at the center, ideally beneath a gap in the roof to let smoke escape, though that same opening tended to invite in just as much cold as it released. As for furniture, there was little to speak of: a stone to sit upon, a level patch to rest on, and perhaps a heap of hides for sleeping. Luxury meant a snug corner free of drafts and a roof that managed not to drip. And yet, working with such limited materials, prehistoric people still managed to construct homes that did the job. They were far from handsome, but they kept you alive, mostly dry and now and then upright through a windstorm. Raising children in the Paleolithic came with no manuals, no advice from experts, and most definitely no strollers. The moment a child arrived, you became responsible for keeping a small, loud, alarmingly fragile human alive in a world crowded with cliffs, predators, and sharp stones. And you had to manage it without misplacing your spear or your composure. Childbirth itself was an event that involved the whole community. It was painful, messy, and dangerous, and surviving it was only the beginning. Next came the endless work of keeping the child warm, fed, and away from the fire, which they seemed magnetically drawn to touch. There were no diapers, infants were wrapped in soft hides or plant fiber, and the inevitable messes were simply accepted as part of the arrangement. Mothers usually nursed their young for years, since there was no substitute available, and pre-chewing meat for a toddler was hardly an efficient use of anyone's time. Discipline tended to be blunt and practical. When a child wandered too near the edge of a drop, there was no gentle time-out to be had. You seized them and delivered a short, urgent warning. The stakes were simply too high to soften. Touching flames, chasing after wolves, and sampling unfamiliar berries all counted as teachable moments, ideally addressed before anything caught fire or produced strange visions. Still, this kind of parenting was not all peril. Children played endlessly with sticks, pebbles, feathers, insects, and anything else that struck them as interesting, and through that play they learned. A little one who loved hurling rocks might grow into the group's finest hunter. A quiet child who preferred watching the elders might one day become a healer or a keeper of ritual. Nobody asked what a child hoped to be someday. You simply grew into a role shaped by your talents and a fair helping of luck. Older children took on chores, fetching kindling and water and shooing birds away from drying meat, and by around the age of 10 they were regarded as reasonably useful members of the band. There were no lessons or schools, only observation, repetition, and a great deal of trial and error, learned firsthand from a world that came with no warning labels attached. After a full day of hunting, gathering, scraping hides, dodging animals, and raising children without a moment's relief, early humans finally reached something we might loosely call downtime. It was hardly a matter of leisurely feasts and lazy mornings, but it counted for something. The center of it all, once more, was the fire. As the sun sank and visibility dwindled to little more than a hope of not tripping over a sleeping dog, the group drew together around the flames, not to celebrate, but because it was the only source of warmth and light that would not bite back. It became the tribe's meeting place all the same, where everyone came to eat, talk, and let the tension of the day ease. These evening conversations were never idle remarks about the weather. They were storytelling sessions, occasions to recount the day's events, to stretch the details of a hunt well past the truth, and to spin tales of spirits, ancestors, or the memorable time someone tumbled into the river chasing a fish. Storytelling did more than entertain. It was the vessel through which knowledge travelled, which foods to eat, which to avoid, where the best hunting could be found, all delivered with dramatic grunts and sweeping gestures. Music and dancing turned up as well, though coordination was never the point. One person might knock two stones together in a rough rhythm, while another hummed or chanted, and before long a few children would be spinning in dizzy circles simply because no one had told them to stop. Instruments amounted to hollow bones, stretched hide drums, and anything at all that produced a satisfying sound. Boasting had its place too. A successful hunter would find ways to mention the achievement more than once, and a person who had shaped a fine tool would display it casually while pretending to be indifferent. Status had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with skill, who could hunt, who could lead, and who could keep a fire alive without singeing their own eyebrows. And there was, of course, flirting. With so few prospects around, romantic gestures tended toward the subtle, such as sharing food, sitting a little closer than necessary, or generously declining to laugh when someone mistook a pile of dung for a rare and valuable root. Courtship, then, was quiet, practical, and generally involved more grunting than poetry. Yet somehow, early humans still found their way into lasting partnerships. The first step was simply proximity. You belonged to a small band of perhaps 20 to 40 people, which meant your options amounted to whoever had not already been claimed and was not a relative. It was far from ideal, and there was certainly no prehistoric equivalent of a dating app, unless you count catching someone's gaze while chewing on the same roasted squirrel. Sharing food was a meaningful signal. Offering someone the choicest cut of meat or a handful of berries you were under no obligation to give away announced genuine interest. Helping another person scrape a hide or carry water was, likewise, a promising gesture. Early romance rested on effort rather than eloquence. Appearance mattered, but only to a degree, since everyone wore roughly the same combination of fur and grime. What truly counted was your ability to survive. A capable hunter or a skilled forager stood a far better chance of attracting a partner than someone who lingered by the fire all day carving lumpy, questionable little figures. Pair bonds were often long-lasting, though not always permanent. Couples stayed together to cooperate, to raise children, to share food, and to weather harsh winters, and when things stopped working, the parting was usually quiet, marked by fewer shared tasks and a little more silence during group meals. Relationships were probably more flexible than we tend to assume, and some anthropologists suggest early humans were less possessive than the farming societies that came later, with group needs, mobility, and survival shaping the rules of partnership far more than personal jealousy ever did. There were no love songs to be sung, only quiet companionship, a shared blanket, and the shared understanding that neither of you wished to face the dark or a hungry predator, entirely alone. It may not have resembled romance as we know it, but it worked. Paleolithic couples built families, raised children, and endured countless storms together, all without ever once arguing over who had forgotten to wash the dishes, mostly because there were no dishes to wash. Even with the endless work of hunting, foraging, and simply staying alive, early humans still made room for something that feels unmistakably human. They made art. There were no galleries to display it, no museums to preserve it, and certainly no critics ready to call a piece delightfully abstract. What they had instead were walls. Big, cold, blank cave walls, and by all appearances those surfaces seemed to be asking for a little decoration. The oldest cave paintings we know of reach back more than 30,000 years, and some of the most celebrated examples survive in places like Lascaux and Chauvet in what is now France. These were not idle scribbles. They showed animals, bison, deer, horses, and mammoths, rendered with a surprising sense of accuracy and even movement. Some included lines that suggested a running gait. Others were dotted with handprints, marks, and symbols whose meaning still slips through our fingers. The tools behind these images were humble. Artists worked with natural pigments, charcoal, ochre, and manganese, ground from crushed minerals and blended with water, animal fat, or plain saliva. For application, they relied on fingers, sticks, the chewed ends of plant stems, or hollow bones used to blow a mist of colour across a hand pressed flat against the rock. In other words, prehistoric people were quietly inventing the airbrush long before it ever appeared on the side of a motorcycle. As for why they painted, no one can say with certainty. Perhaps it was a form of storytelling. Perhaps it grew out of spiritual belief. Or perhaps someone simply had a natural eye for arrangement, and no one thought to tell them to put the pigment down. Some anthropologists suspect the images were tied to hunting rituals, a way of calling forth good fortune, or of passing along useful knowledge about which creatures to pursue and which ones were better left alone. Most of this work happened by firelight, deep inside caves, in chambers where no one actually lived. That detail matters. It means these people were making art purely for its own sake. There was no profit in it, no audience clamouring for more, only the quiet act of human expression in one of its earliest forms. Children seem to have joined in as well. A number of caves preserve tiny handprints, hinting that even the youngest members were shown how to leave a mark of their own. We will never learn who sketched the very first bison, but the odds are good that someone stood nearby, either grunting in approval or offering some thoroughly unhelpful critique. What stays with us is how long this work endured. The shelters rotted, the fire pits crumbled to dust, and still those painted animals go galloping across the stone. It is proof that even 30,000 years ago, people needed something beyond food and shelter. They needed to create. Or, at the very least, they were extremely fond of bison. Falling ill or getting hurt in the Paleolithic was a bit like rolling dice with fate, except the dice were carved from bone and most of the faces came up badly. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, and nothing resembling an urgent care clinic. If you broke a bone, opened a gash, or woke up with a strange rash, the best possible outcome was that your body sorted it out on its own. The worst outcome usually involved everyone gathering around your fire, keeping a slightly awkward distance and hoping whatever you had was not catching. Medical care did exist, but it was rudimentary in the extreme. Early humans very likely understood that certain plants could dull pain or ease swelling. Chewed bark, roots, and crushed herbs may have served as a first draft of medicine. Willow bark, for example, carries salicylic acid, the very compound behind aspirin. So, somewhere in the distant past, one Paleolithic person became the first to discover pain relief by gnawing thoughtfully on a tree. For wounds, the routine tended to involve rinsing the injury with water or with antiseptic plants when they were known, wrapping it in animal hide or soft moss, and then keeping a careful eye on it. The true threat was infection, not the cut itself. There were no sterile dressings, so if a wound turned red, grew hot, and began to smell, that odour was essentially the scent of trouble arriving. Broken bones went either way. Some healed cleanly, others never did. Archaeologists have uncovered prehistoric skeletons bearing fractures that mended well, which suggests that care was given and rest was somehow enforced. Yet there is also evidence of people who clearly kept walking on damaged limbs, because standing still was rarely an option. Teeth caused their own share of misery. They wore down under the constant grind of tough meat and grit-laced plants. Outright cavities were uncommon, but decay and jaw infections still occurred, and the remedy was blunt: extraction with a stone and no anesthetic whatsoever. Shamans, or the group's medicine people, likely filled the role of earliest physicians. They were part herbalist, part spiritual guide, and part the one person willing to handle the unpleasant tasks no one else would touch. They leaned on ritual, on chants, and on substances we might today regard as mildly hallucinogenic. Was any of it science? No. Did it ever work? Sometimes, honestly, yes. The plain truth is that healing in this era was a blend of trial, error, and hard survival instinct. You were given rest, you were given attention, and now and then you were simply given luck. And when the luck ran out, your place by the fire was quietly filled by someone else before the next nightfall. In the Paleolithic world there were no carts, no wheels, no roads, and no notion whatsoever of hitching a ride. If you wanted to reach somewhere else, you walked. That was the entire method. Travel was never a convenience, it was a physical commitment. Whether you were relocating camp, trailing a herd, or putting distance between yourself and the neighbors who kept helping themselves to your firewood, it always came down to your own 2 feet. Mobility was not optional. Paleolithic bands were generally nomadic, shifting with the seasons, with the availability of food, and possibly just to escape the accumulated smell of the old campsite. There were no leases on a patch of ground. Once the local resources were exhausted, or the mammoths wandered off, the people wandered after them. A journey might be brief, a single day's walk to a nearby hunting ground, or it might stretch across dozens of miles over days or even weeks. And everything came along. Tools, hides, fire starting kit, whatever food remained, and the children all had to be bundled up and carried, most of it hauled on someone's back. There were no suitcases, only pouches sewn from leather and baskets woven from reeds. The weather was its own companion on the road. Travelling meant exposure, to rain, to wind, to snow. All of it endured directly, quite possibly while trying to persuade an exhausted 5-year-old that yes, they really did have to keep climbing that hill. Navigation relied not on maps but on memory, on landmarks, on the patterns of the stars, on animal tracks, and on knowledge handed down by word of mouth across generations. The mountains shaped like a sleeping bear, or the bend in the river that always smelled a little off, were about as close to road signs as anyone got. Group movement had to be coordinated. Scouts might range ahead to check the path for danger. The rest followed with care, often walking in single file. If a person was injured, the whole band slowed to match them. If the weather turned, shelter had to be found quickly. Speed mattered, but staying together mattered just as much, because becoming separated in the prehistoric wilderness was rarely something anyone survived. Even so, these people covered astonishing distances. Fossils and artifacts reveal that Paleolithic humans migrated clear across continents on foot. No maps guided them, no water bottles eased the trek, and no music kept them company, only survival, aching feet, and that stubborn human urge to find out what lay beyond the next rise. After a full day of hunting, gathering, walking, minding children, mending tools, and generally not dying, early humans closed out the day in the one place that made any sense, gathered around the fire. The sun sank fast, and with no lamps or electric light to hold it off, darkness came quickly and without any room for argument. That was the cue for the group to ease into the last act of the day, a mixture of unwinding and quiet survival housekeeping. Dinner, if fortune had cooperated, might be roasted meat, boiled roots, or whatever edible thing had failed to get away earlier. Meals were shared in common, everyone arranged in a loose ring, crouched or sitting cross-legged, eating with hands, with bones, or with the occasional sharpened stick. There was no formal etiquette, though unspoken rules certainly applied. Chief among them, you did not grab the last bite unless you were the one who had speared it. Once the food was gone, people talked, and not only about survival plans or where the next meal might come from. They traded stories, myths and memories, along with cautionary tales about the one fellow who had tried to embrace a porcupine. Oral storytelling was the Paleolithic version of an evening's entertainment, only without any buffering. These tales carried knowledge forward, kept the children amused, and almost certainly inflated everyone's hunting record by a comfortable margin. Sometimes there was music, simple rhythmic chants or calls tossed back and forth between voices. A length of bone might serve as a flute, a hollow log as a drum. The sound was rough, but it did not need polish. It held the cold at bay for just a little longer. By that point, most of the group was thoroughly worn out. The day left little energy for deep reflection on the meaning of existence. The children faded first, curling up beside their parents or burrowing into a heap of furs. The adults lingered a while longer, gazing into the flames as though answers might be hiding there, or perhaps simply staring at nothing, which amounts to much the same thing. Before sleep, someone always tended the fire, the quiet, unsung guardian of the whole camp. If the flames were sinking, they were fed. If the wind changed direction, the windbreaks were shifted. And if anyone neglected the task, they would hear about it soon enough, come morning. In December of 1938, two German scientists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, aimed a stream of neutrons at uranium, and what they saw made no sense at first. They had not merely rearranged the element, they had broken it apart. Nuclear fission had just been discovered. News of the experiment tore through the international physics community like a bolt of lightning. The implications were still purely theoretical, yet one point stood out at once. If fission could be controlled and directed, it might release an explosion of almost unimaginable force. That prospect frightened the scientific world, and nowhere more than in the United States, because Nazi Germany, home to some of the finest physicists alive, had just taken the opening step toward a weapon capable of ending everything. The physicist, Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jew who had already fled Europe, grasped the danger immediately. If Hitler's researchers assembled an atomic bomb first, the world would not simply lose a war, it might forfeit its future. Together with his fellow refugee Albert Einstein, Szilard composed a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning that the Germans could be pursuing exactly such a weapon. Einstein added his signature. The letter reached the president in October of 1939, less than 2 months after the Second World War had begun. Roosevelt did not leap into action, but neither did he brush it aside. He established an advisory committee on uranium, and funding began to seep in, slowly. In the beginning, the United States simply was not prepared to treat nuclear physics as an instrument of war. That reluctance would not last. By 1941, British researchers had confirmed that the bomb was feasible, Japan had struck Pearl Harbor, and the United States had entered the war. What had been a vague unease abruptly became a high-stakes race against the clock. In stepped General Leslie Groves, a blunt, no-nonsense military engineer who had just overseen construction of the Pentagon. In 1942, he was placed at the head of the newly created Manhattan Engineer District with a mission that read simply on paper: build an atomic bomb before the Nazis could. In reality, it became the most secretive, most expensive, and most scientifically demanding undertaking ever attempted. Groves recruited a young, flamboyant theoretical physicist to lead the science, J. Robert Oppenheimer, a man both brilliant and controversial, capable of working out particle probabilities and reciting Sanskrit poetry in a single breath. Together they set in motion what would come to be called the Manhattan Project, a $2 billion gamble that would permanently reshape the nature of warfare and the fate of the world. The Manhattan Project was never a single laboratory experiment. It was closer to an empire. To achieve the impossible, the United States government conjured an entire hidden civilization spread across the country and wrapped in secrecy. No one outside the project knew its true aim, and most of the people working inside it did not know either. At the center of this concealed world stood three principal sites. The first was Los Alamos, New Mexico, a dusty mesa chosen precisely because it was so remote. This became the brain of the operation, where theory met engineering. Here Oppenheimer gathered a remarkable team: Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman, Enrico Fermi, and dozens more. Many were European emigrants who had fled fascism, and some had no real idea what they were helping to build. The second site was Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where entire factories, some as long as several football fields, rose from bare ground. Their task was to enrich uranium, one of the two elements an atomic bomb required. The trouble was that uranium-235 was extraordinarily scarce, making up less than 1% of natural uranium. So the engineers tried every method they could devise: gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, even machines called calutrons. Thousands of workers, most of them women, ran equipment they did not understand, never told that they were refining the fuel for a bomb. The third of these hidden cities rose at Hanford in the state of Washington, and its purpose was to grow plutonium. This was the second of the two roads that led toward a bomb. Plutonium was not something you could dig out of the ground in any useful quantity, because nature simply did not provide it. Instead, in enormous nuclear reactors planted far from anything and anyone, ordinary uranium could be bombarded until the new elements slowly formed inside it. Once made, the plutonium still had to be teased out, purified, and carried across the country to Los Alamos, where it would be turned into a weapon. The reactors never rested. Day and night, without pause, they manufactured an element that had barely existed before, and, along with it, a fresh catalogue of hazards. Leaks of radiation, creeping contamination, and the long environmental debts of the atomic era all trace their beginnings to places like this. More than 130,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project, a workforce larger than the entire population of some American states at the time. They lived in towns that appeared out of nowhere, fitted with houses, schoolrooms, shops, and fences patrolled by guards. Letters were opened and censored. Telephone conversations were listened to. Workers were told precisely as much as their jobs required, and not one word more. So complete was the secrecy that Vice President Harry Truman himself had no notion of what the project even was until the day he became president. This was never merely an experiment in physics. It was industrial and military, tangled in bureaucracy, and thoroughly, unavoidably human. Within those fenced towns, people fell in love and married, children were born, accidents left people injured, workers grew bored on quiet shifts, and some of them died, all in the service of a thing they were forbidden to name aloud. The project had swelled into a secret nation folded inside the visible one, and with each passing day it crept nearer to producing the deadliest weapon anyone had ever conceived. J. Robert Oppenheimer did not resemble the ordinary military contractor, nor even the ordinary scientist. He was brilliant and restless, refined in manner and drawn to philosophy. A man who spoke 6 languages, quoted the Bhagavad Gita from memory, and rarely put down his cigarette. His tongue could be cutting, his health was frail, and yet he possessed an unusual gift for untangling theoretical problems that had left everyone else stumped. To some of his colleagues he seemed more poet than physicist, but when the pressure mounted, he was the substance that bound Los Alamos together. Appointed the project's scientific director by General Leslie Groves, Oppenheimer soon showed that he was far more than a man of the lecture hall. He understood people, and he understood politics. He could win loyalty and soothe the enormous egos around him, which was no ordinary achievement given that his laboratory was crowded with some of the finest minds on the planet, many of them Nobel laureates, each accustomed to being the cleverest person in any room. He also carried shadows. Oppenheimer's earlier ties to members of the Communist Party, among them his own brother and a former lover named Jean Tatlock, drew the wary attention of military intelligence. Groves brushed the objections aside and kept him on regardless, though the file bearing Oppenheimer's name grew steadily thicker. What made him indispensable was his rare ability to see how abstract equations might be forged into working machinery. At Los Alamos he led with a blend of charm and near-total obsession, often surviving on only a few hours of sleep. He hurried from chalkboard to chalkboard and from one meeting to the next, jotting formulas, arguing over designs, and smoking through the night until the sky lightened. He stood at the center of everything: the arrangement of atoms, the shaping of bomb casings, the reflectors meant to bounce neutrons back into the core, even the seating order at briefings. And he was acutely aware of what all of it meant. Oppenheimer had believed, sincerely, that reaching the bomb before Nazi Germany was a moral duty. But as the war in Europe wound toward its close, and the German nuclear effort fell apart, his certainty began to fray. The weapon was no longer a shield held up against a dangerous enemy. It was turning into an instrument of politics. That contradiction gnawed at him. He had gathered the greatest intellects of his generation to summon a destruction the world had never imagined, and every triumph carried them not toward victory, but toward a boundary that, once crossed, could never be recrossed. In private, he wavered and doubted. In public, he stayed fixed on the task. As the designs neared completion, one cold realization sharpened for him. They were not simply going to alter the conduct of war. They were about to change the whole relationship between humanity and power itself. By the closing months of 1944, theory had hardened into blueprints, blueprints into components, components into prototypes. The Manhattan Project had stopped being a question and become a production line for catastrophe. Yet assembling a nuclear bomb was nothing like building a tank or an aircraft. Every stretch of the work was unmapped ground, and none of it came easily. The engineers, machinists, and physicists at Los Alamos now bent their attention toward 2 entirely different bombs, each with its own frightening difficulty. The first was the uranium design, nicknamed Little Boy. It worked on the idea of a gun. Fire one piece of uranium-235 into a second piece at great speed, and the collision sets off a chain reaction. The concept was almost crude in its simplicity and appalling in its effect. The enriched uranium came from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in painfully small amounts, each gram wrung out through immense labor, and they needed more than 60 kilograms of it. Every figure had to be exact because there would be no rehearsal. Little Boy was destined to go directly to war, untested. The second bomb, Fat Man, ran on plutonium, and plutonium proved far more temperamental. The gun method simply would not do, because plutonium tended to detonate too early, sputtering out before it ever reached full force. A wholly different approach was required, one called implosion. Explosive lenses, timed with extraordinary precision, would squeeze a plutonium core inward until it reached critical mass in a matter of microseconds. It was rather like trying to crush a steel ball perfectly evenly from every direction using dynamite, without so much as cracking its surface. Worse still, plutonium was poisonous, unstable, and so newly created that no one fully understood it. The scientists labored under crushing secrecy and strain, and accidents did occur. In 1945, the physicist Harry Daghlian let a tungsten brick slip onto a plutonium core, triggering a burst of critical reaction. He absorbed a fatal dose of radiation and died some weeks afterward. That same sphere, which came to be known as the Demon Core, would later kill a second scientist, Louis Slotin, in an unnervingly similar mishap. Every stride forward exacted a price, physical, mental, and moral all at once. All the while, the clock was running down. Germany had surrendered. Japan fought on. Washington demanded results. The men and women at Los Alamos knew what they were making, though not where it would fall or whose lives it would end. In the workshops, the last pieces came together. Metal shells, precise detonators, cores of nuclear fuel, each one a small wonder of engineering, and together the most lethal creation in human history. Only one thing remained, and that was to prove it worked, not on paper, not in a simulation, but in fire, in open desert, in the real world. On July 16, 1945, at exactly 5:29 in the morning, the New Mexico desert became the cradle of the atomic age. The test was code-named Trinity, and it marked the first detonation of a nuclear device anywhere on Earth. The bomb they set off used the plutonium implosion design, the very type that would become Fat Man, and it had never been fired before. Little Boy, resting on plain physics, was trusted to work. Fat Man's intricate implosion mechanism was another matter, and it might fail, fizzle feebly, or destroy everything nearby. Nerves were stretched thin. Oppenheimer, Groves, and hundreds of scientists gathered at observation posts miles away from the tower. Many wore welder's goggles. Some had smeared sunscreen across their faces in the hope of blunting a light no one had yet seen. A few even placed wagers on whether the blast might set the atmosphere itself ablaze. It sounds ridiculous today, but in that hour they honestly could not rule it out. At the instant of detonation, the desert erupted in a flash brighter than the sun. The shockwave threw people to the ground. The heat could be felt from more than 10 miles away. A mushroom cloud climbed 40,000 feet into the sky, and for a moment the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. One witness said it was like standing present at the birth of the world. Another felt as though the gates of hell had swung open. Oppenheimer did not cheer. Instead, he murmured a line drawn from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test had succeeded, a terrifying and unarguable success. It confirmed that the United States now held a weapon capable of erasing whole cities in seconds. It also opened a deep moral reckoning that would not close. Photographs were taken and measurements set down. A glassy greenish sand, later named Trinitite, had formed where the tower once stood. But what lingered longest was not any number in a logbook. It was the silence, the awe, and the haunting knowledge that mankind had stepped over a threshold it could never step back across. Word of the test was locked away with great care. President Truman, then attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, learned of it through a coded message: "The baby is born." The war in the Pacific still raged, and Japan had not surrendered. Now the United States possessed the power to annihilate, and the only remaining questions were where the weapon would be used, and when. Less than a month later, the theoretical horror turned real. 2 working bombs existed, and with them a grave decision. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay rose from Tinian Island carrying Little Boy, the uranium bomb, toward Hiroshima, a city of genuine military value that was also home to countless civilians. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomb fell, and 43 seconds later the sky tore open. The explosion flattened 5 square miles of the city. At the very center, temperatures reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. More than 70,000 people died in an instant, vaporized or crushed. Fires swept through the ruins, and survivors, burned and blinded, wandered a nightmare of twisted metal and ash. In the weeks that followed, tens of thousands more would die of radiation sickness, wounds, and shock. Even so, the war did not end. Japan's leaders hesitated, some seeking surrender and others clinging to conditions. Reading the silence as defiance, the United States readied a second blow. On August the 9th, the plutonium bomb Fat Man was loaded aboard another B-29 named Boxcar. Its first target was Kokura, but clouds hid the city and forced a change, and so the bomb fell on Nagasaki at 11,002 in the morning. The surrounding hills contained the blast to a degree, yet the ruin was still immense. Roughly 40,000 people died at once, as factories, houses, and temples were obliterated, and again thousands more would perish in the following days from burns, injuries, and radiation. Within hours, the Japanese cabinet gathered in disarray, and Emperor Hirohito himself intervened. For the first time in the nation's history, a Japanese emperor spoke directly to his people, announcing an unconditional surrender. The war was finished, but the argument was only beginning. Had the bombs ended the fighting, or had they ushered in something darker still? Were they truly necessary, or a monstrous display of force? Some scientists had pleaded for a harmless demonstration in place of an attack on a living city, and their appeals had been set aside. Others, General Groves among them, felt no regret whatsoever. The world had entered a new condition, one in which peace itself was held together by the threat of total destruction. Militarily, the bomb had done exactly what was asked of it, but the deeper questions, moral and philosophical and spiritual, would keep echoing for generations. What no one could deny was that in 2 flashes of light the 20th century had split cleanly in 2, into the world that existed before the bomb and everything that followed after. The mushroom clouds had scarcely dispersed before the world, and above all the people who had built the thing began to grapple with what they had done. At Los Alamos, the celebrations were oddly subdued. The bomb had worked, and the war was over, yet the sheer scale of the devastation shook even its makers. Photographs of charred bodies and levelled streets found their way back to the laboratories, and the accounts of survivors filtered in. Scientists who had poured their brilliance into the weapon now peered into a moral abyss, and many felt they had loosed something far larger than they had grasped. Oppenheimer above all was broken by it. Once the magnetic heart of the project, he was now a haunted man. In a meeting with President Truman soon after the war, he reportedly said, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, by his staff's account, was repulsed, and afterward dismissed Oppenheimer as a crybaby scientist. but the crisis of conscience belonged to more than one man. Scientists such as Leo Szilard and James Frank passed around petitions urging openness and international oversight of these weapons, warning that secrecy and unchecked arsenals could only breed an arms race. Their warnings went unheeded. The United States instead drew its nuclear research tighter, the Atomic Energy Commission was established, and the Cold War began to smoulder. The Soviets, already well informed about the Manhattan Project through extensive espionage, were racing to forge a bomb of their own. Meanwhile, far from the headlines, thousands of ordinary workers who had spent the war years inside the Manhattan Project were only now beginning to understand what they had helped build. At the sprawling secret sites of Oak Ridge in Tennessee and Hanford in Washington, most had done their jobs without ever being told the purpose behind them. They had done their work without ever knowing that its end product was a weapon, and for many the truth arrived the way it did for everyone else, through a newspaper or a radio broadcast. Some felt a quiet pride at having helped end a long and brutal war. Others felt something much closer to horror. The public, too, was divided. At first, American newspapers cheered without reservation, for the war was over and a fearsome enemy had been defeated. But as photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to reach the wider world, the mood grew more complicated and hard questions followed. Might Japan have been brought to surrender by some other means? Had both bombs truly been necessary, or would one have been enough? Was this an act of justice, or was it vengeance wearing the clothing of justice? Then came the slower, stranger reckoning of radiation. The survivors of the bombings, who came to be known as the hibakusha, suffered burns, cancers, miscarriages, and a lifelong stigma that lingered long after the fires had gone out. Fallout studies began. The toll of these weapons was not only physical and immediate. It was generational, with damage written into DNA, birth defects in children not yet born, and psychological trauma that lingered for decades. The war had ended, but for many its consequences were only just beginning. The project had achieved exactly what it set out to do, and in doing so had left a legacy of sorrow, secrecy, and moral confusion that would define the nuclear age. Science had broken through a barrier, but humanity had not yet caught up to what it had done. And while the bomb had been assembled in secret deserts and hidden laboratories, it proved far less secret than the American government had hoped. Even as the United States celebrated its new atomic supremacy, its security had already been breached, and Soviet agents had slipped quietly through. The project had been compromised almost from the beginning. Through an extensive espionage network, the Soviet Union knew about the bomb long before it was dropped. Certain key scientists, among them Klaus Fuchs, a theoretical physicist working within Los Alamos itself, were quietly passing the details of the weapon's design straight to Moscow. The information Fuchs supplied was so precise that Soviet engineers later admitted using his data as a template for a bomb of their own. He did not act alone. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, American civilians with ties to the Communist Party, were accused of handing atomic secrets to the Soviets. Their trial and execution in 1953 shocked the nation and became one of the most bitterly disputed episodes in Cold War history. Whether they were genuine traitors or convenient scapegoats is still argued over today. But whatever the truth, the larger message was unmistakable. The nuclear genie was out of the bottle, and it no longer belonged to a single country. In 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. It happened faster than most American officials had thought possible, and the arms race was now formally underway. America's monopoly on ultimate destruction had lasted less than half a decade. What followed was a new kind of warfare, fought not with bullets, but with nerve and brinkmanship. Nations now held weapons that could erase entire cities in a single flash. The logic of conflict shifted. Victory no longer belonged to whoever fielded more troops. It belonged to whoever could survive a nuclear first strike or answer it with something deadlier in return. Back in the United States, paranoia grew. There were loyalty oaths and background checks, the hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the wider fever of the Red Scare. Scientists once celebrated as national heroes suddenly found themselves accused, blacklisted, and interrogated. Even Robert Oppenheimer, the man remembered as the father of the bomb, was stripped of his security clearance in a humiliating hearing that laid bare just how sharply the political climate had turned. The bomb had won one war, but it had lit the fuse of another, a war colder, more psychological, and far more dangerous. From the laboratories of Los Alamos to the labor camps of Siberia, a new era had opened, one in which silence, suspicion, and surveillance held sway, and the threat of total annihilation was never far away. The Manhattan Project formally ended in 1946, but its influence never did. It remade the world scientifically, militarily, politically, and morally, and in many ways marked the true beginning of the modern era. On one side of the ledger, it stood as a scientific achievement without precedent. It proved that theoretical physics could reshape global events and turn pure research into raw power. The same principles that had split the atom would go on to power nuclear reactors, guide the exploration of space, and advance medicine. Nuclear physics became one of the cornerstones of modern science. On the other side of that ledger, the project cast a permanent shadow over the human race. The invention of nuclear weapons did not merely end a war. It redefined the very meaning of peace. For the first time, human beings had created something capable of wiping themselves out entirely. A terrible possibility that has hovered over every international dispute since. The concept of mutually assured destruction became the twisted backbone of Cold War diplomacy. Two superpowers armed to the teeth, locked in a standoff where pulling the trigger meant the end of civilization for everyone. The Manhattan Project also set off a global arms race. First the United States, then the Soviet Union, followed by Britain, France, China, India, and Pakistan, with Israel understood to have joined unofficially, and eventually North Korea, each built weapons of their own. What had begun as a desperate gamble to stop Nazi Germany had become a blueprint for militarization across the planet. And yet, for all its power to devastate, the bomb has only ever been used in war twice. That fact alone is both chilling and remarkable, and it hints at a paradox at the heart of the weapon. The bomb is the ultimate instrument of destruction, and its very horror may be the reason it has not been used again. In film, literature, and philosophy, it forced a reckoning with the limits of progress itself. Could science exist without conscience? Could knowledge be separated from responsibility for what it unleashes? Figures like Oppenheimer remain lasting symbols of that dilemma, neither villain nor hero but simply human, caught between brilliance and guilt, ambition and regret. Reflecting on it all in 1965, Oppenheimer spoke of a crude sense, one that no vulgarity or humour could extinguish, in which, as he put it, the physicists had known sin. Today its legacy lives on in weapons stockpiles and non-proliferation treaties, in a climate of deterrence and the uneasy peace that nuclear fear enforces. The bomb brought a world war to its end. But it also began something else, a permanent and fragile era in which the fate of the world can hinge on the pressing of a single button. In ancient Mesopotamia, the clothing a person wore was never simply about covering the body. It was about broadcasting an identity. Your class, occupation, gender, and even your nearness to the gods were all reflected in what you wore. Fashion here amounted to an elaborate code, and everyone, from priest-kings down to slaves, was expected to follow it. The earliest civilizations, in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, each developed distinct hierarchies of dress. For men, garments ranged from simple skirts of wool or flax to long, elaborately fringed robes that served as badges of status. The more layers, pleats, and embroidery a man wore, the more powerful others assumed him to be. Royalty and nobility favoured cloaks dyed with costly pigments, deep reds, purples, and indigos drawn from rare minerals and plants. Such dyes were not only striking but expensive to produce, so wearing them announced wealth and authority without a word being spoken. Women's clothing carried no less meaning. Elite women wore finely woven gowns that wrapped diagonally across the body and often left one shoulder bare, with decorative fringes trailing along the hems. Jewelry was essential. Necklaces of gold, earrings of lapis lazuli, and beads of carnelian signalled not just beauty but divine favour or aristocratic bloodline, while bracelets, anklets, and hairpieces spoke of both spiritual belief and marital status. Even hairstyles were carefully considered. Men took great pride in their beards, curling, oiling, and sometimes crimping them into intricate patterns, for a beard was a mark of masculinity and wisdom. Women arranged their hair in buns, braids, and elaborate rolls, and wigs were worn by both sexes on ceremonial occasions, and by the upper classes to display refinement. Perfumes and cosmetics added the finishing layer. Oils scented with myrrh or cedar anointed the skin, and eye makeup, often a dark kohl, was applied not only for beauty, but as protection against evil spirits and the sun's harsh glare. As for shoes, most Mesopotamians went barefoot, though the elite sometimes wore sandals of leather or even silver, purely for ceremony. Here, fashion was never frivolous. It was functional, symbolic, and enforced by both religious and political institutions, and what a person wore could raise them up or condemn them. Even 5,000 years ago, people understood that appearances ran far deeper than the surface. In ancient Egypt, fashion served a function that was frankly divine. What you wore signalled far more than wealth or taste. It reflected your connection to the gods themselves. It was a matter of purity, power, and eternal style. And in a land where life and death were tightly interwoven, your wardrobe had to suit both this world and the next. Linen was king. Drawn from the flax plant, it was the primary fabric for Egyptians of every rank, soft, lightweight, and well suited to the desert heat. But not all linen was equal. The upper class wore a finely woven, almost transparent cloth that fell in elegant folds, while pharaohs and nobles wore pleated kilts and robes with ornate sashes, often starched and shaped for dramatic effect. The whiter and finer the linen, the more it stood for purity and for favour with the gods. For women, fashion was both sensual and symbolic. Elite women wore close-fitting sheath dresses, known as the calasiris, often held up by shoulder straps. These garments concealed little, but in Egyptian culture beauty and fertility were divine virtues, and clothing was meant to celebrate the natural form. Modesty as we know it was not the aim, harmony and sacred aesthetics were. Jewelry was a kind of spiritual armor. Amulets shaped like scarabs, ankhs, and the Eye of Horus were common, and gold, believed to be incorruptible, was the preferred metal of the gods. Broad collars called the wesek, worn by both men and women, were layered with turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian to offer protection and divine favor. Wigs, too, were a daily choice for the elite. Most Egyptians shaved their heads for hygiene and to keep away lice, but wigs of human hair or plant fiber signaled rank and beauty. Some were enormous and intricately braided, perfumed with cones of scented wax that melted in the heat and released their fragrance through the day. Makeup was essential as well. Kohl eyeliner was not merely stylish, it shielded the eyes from the sun's glare and was thought to ward off evil spirits, while green malachite eyeshadow and red ochre lip stain were worn by men and women alike. Looking good was serious business, for the gods were always watching. From the workers who raised the pyramids to the priests and queens, what an Egyptian wore was never only a fashion choice. It was a sacred statement about status, about the soul, and about the long journey into eternity. At first glance, the fashion of ancient Greece can seem almost plain, with its flowing fabrics, minimal seams, and clean lines. But look closer, and you find a world coded with identity, status, and civic value. In Greece, and especially during the classical period, clothing was not about extravagance. It was about order, proportion, and, quite literally, philosophy. Greek garments were typically rectangular pieces of wool or linen, artfully draped and pinned rather than cut and tailored. The most iconic of these was the chiton, a tunic fastened at the shoulders and belted at the waist. Men's chitons usually reached the knee, while women's fell to the ankle, and even that length carried a message. A long chiton on a man suggested youth or the priesthood, while a short one spoke of athleticism, labour, or military life. Over the chiton, both men and women might wear the himation, a large cloak draped across one shoulder. Philosophers famously wore it wound tightly, creating a dignified, severe silhouette that mirrored their Stoic ideals, so that it became a silent advertisement for intellect and civic virtue. Women also wore the peplos, a heavier woolen garment folded over at the top to create a double layer across the torso. That fold, the apoptygma, was both decorative and meaningful, highlighting the modesty and femininity so prized in Athenian society. The way a woman arranged her peplos could signal her marital status, her mourning, or her role in a religious festival. And colour, though used with restraint, played its own subtle but important role. Among the Greeks, white carried the weight of purity and ceremony, the shade a person reached for when the occasion called for something solemn or sacred. Darker cloth belonged to mourning, worn in the days when grief was carried openly on the body. Saffron yellow and deep, saturated purples were rarer still, costly enough that they surfaced only during particular rituals or within the wardrobes of the wealthiest households. Ornament was kept sparing. Patterns tended toward the minimal, though a band of geometric borders or a run of embroidery along a hem or neckline could add visual weight and quietly announce a person's standing. Hair and accessories were arranged with equal care. Men generally kept their hair cropped short, while the styles worn by women ranged widely from season to season and occasion to occasion. Braids, gathered buns, and loose curls each had their moment. Jewelry followed the same restrained logic, elegant without excess. Gold earrings, finely worked hairpins, and bracelets coiled into the shape of a snake or curling like a leaf. Footwear was often optional altogether. Many Greeks moved about barefoot at home, and even during religious observances bare feet were common. When shoes did appear, they were usually plain leather sandals or soft, supple boots, nothing that drew the eye away from the line of the garment itself. Here, form and function met in the middle. Greek dress was, in essence, elegance arrived at through discipline. In a culture preoccupied with balance and virtue, the fall of a tunic or the knot of a sash was never merely decorative. It stood as a reflection of how a person lived, how they reasoned, and how they gave something back to the polis. If the Greeks used clothing to express their ideals, the Romans used it to broadcast their dominance. Roman dress was bold, tightly regulated, and thick with symbolism, engineered to mirror the empire's rigid social ladder and its appetite for spectacle and control. What a Roman put on in the morning was frequently less a matter of taste than a matter of law. The most recognizable garment of all was the toga, and comfort was never its purpose. Restricted to male Roman citizens, and above all to the elite, the toga was an enormous semicircular sweep of woolen cloth, folded and arranged over the body in a way that demanded either long practice or the assistance of a personal servant. Its colour, its size, and the stripe running through it announced a man's rank the instant he entered a room. The toga virilis, plain and undyed white, was the mark of an adult male citizen. The toga praetexta, edged with a purple border, belonged to magistrates and to boys of high birth. The toga picta, dyed entirely purple and worked with gold, was reserved for generals riding in triumphal processions and, in time, for emperors themselves. To appear in the wrong toga was to court public humiliation and sometimes something graver. Beneath it, men wore the tunica, a simpler knee-length garment gathered at the waist with a belt. Slaves were dressed in rough, undyed tunics. Freedmen sometimes wore striped versions that signalled their new, if still limited, standing. Senators bore a broad purple band called the latus clavus, running down the front. Roman fashion had little interest in individuality. Its message was that a person should know exactly where they stood. Roman women, for their part, wore the stola, a long and flowing dress often paired with the palla, a shawl that could be drawn up over the head in public. Respectable matrons wore their distinctive stolae as a visible badge of chastity and virtue, while prostitutes were forbidden to wear them at all, a dress code that drew a hard line between dignity and disgrace. Jewellery was worn in abundance, especially by women. Rings, necklaces, fibulae, brooches and earrings were more than adornment. They functioned as currency, as markers of status, and as political gifts exchanged to smooth alliances. Wealthy women favoured elaborate coiffures, piled high with curls, braids and pins, an architecture of hair that required both a good mirror and several attendants. Footwear ranged from plain sandals to leather boots dyed red, green or black. Senators even had a shoe of their own, the calceus, finished in black leather and laced across the ankle. In Rome, clothing was at once law, art and propaganda. To be dressed correctly was to embody the values the empire prized most: discipline, hierarchy, conquest and civic pride. A toga was never simply cloth. It was the Roman Republic itself, draped in wool. In the Achaemenid Persian Empire, dress rose to the level of regal theatre. From Darius the Great to Xerxes, Persian rulers clothed themselves not merely to impress, but to intimidate. To watch a Persian nobleman cross a hall was to watch a walking jewel box, shimmering in embroidered silks, gold ornaments and divine imagery. Clothing here spoke of power, but also of the order of the cosmos. Where the Greeks leaned toward restraint, the Persians embraced vivid colour and lavish texture. Silk, which reached them along the earliest trade routes, was held back for the elite. embroidery was everything. Tunics and robes were densely worked with gold thread, mythical animal motifs, and intricate patterns meant to summon fertility, protection, and divine favor. The finer the detail on a garment, the higher its wearer stood, and the nearer they were said to be to the aura of the king. Men typically wore long-sleeved tunics over trousers, an innovation for the age. While most ancient societies remained committed to robes, the Persians adopted fitted trousers for both practicality and style, a choice that would echo forward into Greek, Roman, and even medieval dress. A wide ornamented belt cinched the tunic at the waist, and layered cloaks across the shoulders added both weight and formality. Women's dress was equally refined, though designed to be more modest. Long gowns with fitted bodices and several layers of fabric, wide sleeves and veils. Jewelry was plentiful, from gold necklaces to gemstone bracelets to finely carved rings. Perfume and cosmetics figured prominently as well. Women wore rouge, coal-darkened eyes, and scented oils kept in elegant alabaster jars. Headgear mattered above all. The tiara, or kidaris, a tall pointed headdress often set with pearls or embroidery, was the signature of Persian royalty, while lower-ranking courtiers wore embroidered caps or turbans to signal their loyalty and their place. The more elaborate the headgear, the closer its owner stood to the throne. Colour carried meaning too. Deep blues and purples were kept for royalty and high nobility. White stood for purity and clothed priests during sacred rites, and red and gold represented fire, the holy element of Zoroastrianism, Persia's dominant faith. Nothing here was accidental. Every fold, every gem, every stitched griffin or lion repeated the same message: the cosmos is ordered, the king is divine, and your clothing tells you where you belong within it. In ancient India, dress became an art form bound intimately to religion, climate, and a sense of cosmic balance. From the Vedic period through the Maurya and Gupta empires, Indian clothing carried a deep philosophical outlook in which texture, colour, and drapery were treated as sacred rather than merely decorative. Its cornerstone was unstitched cloth. Instead of tailoring, garments were wrapped, folded, and draped in a variety of regional and symbolic arrangements. This was no shortcut, but a principle. In Hindu belief, stitching was sometimes regarded as impure for ritual wear, so flowing fabric became the canvas on which spiritual identity was expressed. For men, the most common garment was the dhoti, a rectangular length of cloth, frequently white or saffron, wound around the waist and secured with a knot. It could read as formal or casual, and the manner of folding shifted from region to region and caste to caste. Priests, for instance, arranged it in particular ritual folds tied to specific ceremonies. Women wore the sari, still celebrated today, though in ancient times it looked rather different. Usually a single piece of cloth up to 9 yards long, it was wrapped around the waist with one loose end, the palu, drawn over the shoulder or head. It left the midriff bare, not as a matter of style, but as a gesture toward fertility and cosmic openness. And in many temples, the goddesses themselves were depicted adorned in exactly this way, honoring the sacred feminine of the land. The choli, the fitted blouse worn beneath the sari, appeared only later in history. In earlier periods, coverings for the upper body varied enormously according to local custom and weather. In some places, especially across southern India, women wore the sari without any blouse at all, while in colder regions shawls and veils were added. Textiles were the pride of the subcontinent. Cotton was first cultivated here, and Indian weavers mastered block printing, resist dyeing, and spinning so fine it seemed almost impossible. The muslin of Bengal was so delicate that it was called woven air. Silk, too, was a staple of royal and sacred attire, particularly within Buddhist and Jain traditions. Jewelry crossed every class line, from necklaces and banglets and nose rings, each piece carrying astrological, spiritual, or marital significance. Even children wore talismans to turn away evil. Fashion here was never governed by fast-changing trends. It was a living philosophy, soft and unstitched, layered with meaning, and forever attuned to the divine. In ancient China, dress was far more than ornament. It was a living system of ethics, cosmology, and imperial order. Whether under the Shang, the Zhou, or the Han dynasties, what a person wore reflected their social role, their harmony with the universe, and their relationship to the emperor. The defining garment of early Chinese history was the hanfu, a flowing robe with wide sleeves, a crossed collar, and a sash tied at the waist. It was not merely a staple of fashion, but a visible embodiment of Confucian ideals. Modesty, structure, and respect for hierarchy were stitched into every pleat. Men and women alike wore hanfu, though the details of color, fabric, trim, and length differed sharply by class, age, and occasion. Color was strictly governed. Under the Zhou dynasty, codes were set to align with the philosophy of the five elements: yellow for earth and the center, red for fire and the south, blue-green for wood and the east, white for metal and the west, and black for water and the north. Yellow was the most sacred of all, reserved for the emperor alone, and for a commoner to wear it amounted to a direct insult against the throne. Layering was central. Nobles and scholars wore several robes, one atop another, not only for warmth or beauty, but as a mark of refinement. The more layers a person wore, the higher their rank was understood to be. Peasants, by contrast, wore simple tunics of hemp or coarse wool, belted at the waist over trousers or leggings. Silk remained the exclusive domain of the upper class until its production widened centuries later. Women's dress broadly echoed the hanfu silhouette, adding sashes, flowing skirts, and elaborate hairpins. Hair was always tended with care, worn long and pinned up, often finished with jade combs, gold ornaments, or floral motifs, and the higher and more intricate the arrangement, the greater the refinement it implied. Hair left loose in public was considered improper for any woman past childhood. Accessories, too, were dense with meaning. Jade, above all, was seen as the stone of immortality and virtue, and pendants carved with dragons, phoenixes, or clouds stood for blessings and moral strength. Even footwear followed a code, pointed tips, or raised soles, setting the refined apart from the rustic. In ancient China, clothing was harmony given fabric form. It mirrored the natural order, upheld human dignity, and reinforced the invisible scaffolding of the empire, so that to dress properly was not simply courteous but a civic and spiritual duty. To Romanize, the dress of the Celtic and Germanic tribes looked wild, impractical, even savage. But to the people who actually wore it, their clothing was anything but crude. It was powerfully expressive, a reflection of warrior culture, kinship, spiritual belief, and a love of bold identity. Where Mediterranean fashion prized order and hierarchy, these so-called barbarians leaned hard into individuality and flair. Consider the Celts, spread across Gaul, the British Isles, and parts of Central Europe. Celtic men and women wore brightly coloured woolen garments, dyed with natural pigments drawn from plants and minerals. Pattern mattered enormously. Plaids and checks were not merely decorative, they served as tribal identifiers, with each region or clan favouring its own arrangement, centuries before Scotland's tartan system ever took shape. Men typically wore long-sleeved tunics belted at the waist, paired with trousers known as brachae, a sharp departure from the robe-based dress of Rome or Greece. These trousers were warm, flexible, and well suited to riding and combat. Warriors often went into battle shirtless, their bodies covered in tattoos or in the blue war paint made from woad. A display meant both to intimidate the enemy and to invoke sacred ritual. Celtic women wore layered dresses or skirts with shawls or cloaks fastened by ornate brooches called fibulae. Jewelry was worn lavishly, from thick neck rings called torques to bangles, spiral earrings, and amber beads, and these pieces were far more than showpieces. They signalled wealth, tribal role, and sometimes mystical protection. Hair, too, made a statement. Both men and women braided or coiled it, at times bleaching it with lime for dramatic effect, while long, carefully styled moustaches and beards were favoured by the men, above all among the warriors and chieftains. Far to the north and west, the Germanic peoples, from the Goths to the Saxons, approached the problem of clothing along much the same lines. Their wardrobes leaned on tunics, cloaks of woven wool, and furs stacked one layer over another against the cold. Animal hides served a double purpose. Draped across the shoulders as capes, sometimes finished at the edges with teeth or curved claws, they announced a person's rank while also standing in as charms against misfortune. The metalwork that decorated their belts, their clasps, and the fittings of their weapons tended to return again and again to a small set of animals, the wolf, the boar, and the eagle, all creatures thought to carry a current of spiritual force. Roman writers looked at these tribes and saw only the uncivilized, but that judgment missed the point entirely. To the people wearing them, these garments were dense with meaning. They favoured freedom of movement. They declared who a person was, and they knotted the wearer to the land beneath his feet and to the ancestors who had walked it before him. In an age defined by constant movement and near constant fighting, what covered your back was at once a banner, a defence, and a private mythology, worked into wool, into leather, and into bone. By the time the Roman Empire had reshaped itself into the Byzantine Empire, clothing had become a wholly different sort of thing, a blend of Roman authority, the luxuries of the East, and the symbols of Christianity. In Byzantium, dress carried more than the message of wealth or standing. It functioned as a sacred vocabulary. Each thread, each stone, each embroidered image played its part in a performance that was at once religious and political. The court in Constantinople was consumed by ceremony and by the costumes that ceremony demanded. The emperor, understood as God's chosen representative walking among ordinary people, appeared in garments so heavily decorated and so intricately made that they verged on theatre. His robes, the long jewel-studded bands called the lauros, were wound around the body in an elaborate arrangement. Gold thread ran through the cloth as a matter of course. Pearls, sapphires, and garnets were stitched straight into the fabric itself. To stand in the emperor's presence was to look upon a living icon. Colour, meanwhile, was governed by strict law. The deep purple drawn from the rare murex sea snail belonged to the imperial family alone, and anyone else discovered wearing it risked harsh punishment. Even a modest touch of purple on a robe or along the edge of a shoe was read as a claim of nearness to the throne. Senators, clergy, and generals each moved within their own permitted palette, dressed in near-uniform outfits for the great public occasions. The overall style was layered and modest. Men and women alike wore a tunic known as the dalmatica, cut with wide sleeves and marked by embroidered bands called clavi that ran in vertical lines down the front. Over this went a cloak such as the chlamys, held closed by an ornate brooch that was often shaped like a cross or a dove. These layers were never merely practical. They embodied the religious ideals of humility and proper conduct. Women's dress in Byzantium managed to be both lavish and devout at the same time. Women of the elite wore long-sleeved robes with cuffs drawn tight at the wrist, gowns of richly patterned silk, and elaborate coverings for the head. Veils and crowns signaled devotion and authority in a single gesture. Jewelry was worn in abundance, heavy earrings, necklaces of several strands, and golden belts set with the images of saints and other sacred figures. Even their shoes carried embroidery. Christianity left its mark on nearly everything. Crosses, angels, and holy inscriptions appeared on belts, on pins, and along the borders of garments. And the walls of the churches themselves glittered with mosaics that showed saints and royalty wrapped in dazzling robes, real fashion preserved forever in tile and gold. Beyond the palace gates, dress went on imitating the same hierarchy. Merchants, scholars, monks, and household servants all followed clearly marked styles. You did not simply dress for the weather, you dressed for the place assigned to you within God's order. In Byzantium, clothing was less a choice than a fate, blessed by scripture and sewn in silk. A robe was not only a robe, it was a person's gospel. Long before eyeglasses came into existence, poor vision amounted to a life sentence, and often a heavy one. If you were nearsighted, reading and any kind of fine handwork became all but impossible. If you were far-sighted, sewing, carving, and copying out manuscripts turned into a daily ordeal. And for the great span of human history, there was simply no remedy, only a quiet acceptance of the loss. Ancient societies certainly noticed that eyes could fail, but noticing was as far as they could go. The oldest written mention of failing sight comes from ancient Egypt, where medical papyri dating back as far as 1500 BCE describe symptoms that sound very much like presbyopia, the age-related far-sightedness that blurs anything held close. The suggested remedies, however, were largely a matter of herbs or magic. Of any optical device there is no trace. The Greeks and Romans likewise grasped that eyesight tended to decline with the years. Seneca the Younger, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, is said to have read through a glass globe filled with water, which magnified the letters much like a crude lens. It worked, but there was no way to wear it. The first true magnifying lenses emerged during the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars in Baghdad and Cairo were already probing the nature of optics by the 9th century. The mathematician Al-Hazen, also known as Ibn al-Haytham, composed his book of optics in the 11th century and laid down the foundations for a genuine science of vision. He described the way light enters the eye and the way a lens could bend that light on its path. Yet here too the record shows no lenses meant to be worn. Instead, readers of the ancient and medieval world reached for what were called reading stones, polished half-domes of glass or crystal laid directly upon the page to enlarge the writing beneath them. Such tools appear in Europe and the Middle East around the 10th or 11th century. They were genuinely useful and thoroughly awkward, since you had to hold them against the paper, and they magnified only a single line at a time. The real breakthrough arrived in the closing years of the 13th century in the north of Italy, most likely in the busy artisan towns of Pisa or Venice. There, craftsmen began to make the first wearable eyeglasses, lifting the magnifying lens off the tabletop and turning it into something portable and life-changing. These early spectacles were nobody's idea of elegant, but their effect was profound. For the first time, a scholar or a craftsman whose eyes were beginning to fail did not have to abandon his life's work. The earliest lenses were convex, shaped to answer presbyopia, that age-related farsightedness that makes close reading such a strain. Nothing about them was mass-produced. The earliest written reference dates to 1006, when a Dominican friar named Giordano de Pisa told his congregation that it was not yet 20 years since the art of making eyeglasses had been discovered, an art that allowed a person to read and to do fine work, which places the invention somewhere. Each pair was made by hand by a skilled glassworker and set in a plain frame of wood, bone, leather, or metal. There were no arms to hook over the ears. The lenses simply balanced on the nose, or were pinched together, or at times held up by hand. In the 1280s, the glassmakers of Venice, already renowned for their fine crystal, had a central hand in what followed. Their work on the island of Murano, a place given over entirely to glass, produced lenses that were clearer and more consistent than anything before. Before long, eyeglasses had become a quiet but essential companion for monks, for copyists, and for aging scholars everywhere. These early spectacles were never fitted to the individual. There were no eye examinations. A buyer simply worked through the available lenses until he found the one that helped the most. Myopia, or nearsightedness, was still poorly understood, so lenses to correct distance vision would not appear for several centuries yet. Even so, the cultural effect was enormous. In a world that prized literacy, study, and religious learning, eyeglasses handed older people a second beginning. Monks kept copying their texts, physicians kept reading their anatomical diagrams, and painters kept setting down the smallest details. Growing old no longer meant slipping quietly into uselessness. The invention spread quickly across the continent, mostly among the clergy and the educated few, since glasses were costly and illiteracy remained widespread. But news of their usefulness travelled fast, and by the early 14th century spectacles had reached Germany, France, and England. 2 lenses in a frame, nothing more, had altered the whole trajectory of human productivity. Losing your sight was no longer the last chapter. It had become a problem with an answer. As the 14th and 15th centuries wore on, eyeglasses moved out of the monasteries and into the working hands of Europe's expanding middle class. Their arrival coincided with the growth of literacy, of trade, and of city life, and along the way they changed from obscure scholarly instruments into everyday goods, affordable, portable, and steadily more practical. As towns and craft guilds multiplied, more people were learning to read, merchants and artisans and clerks among them. Contracts, ledgers, and inventories all demanded sharp close-up vision, and presbyopia, still the most common complaint that spectacles addressed, no longer forced experienced professionals to step aside. In a world running on writing and arithmetic, eyeglasses became a silent partner in the widening of commerce. By the 15th century they were being hawked by peddlers, apothecaries, and even street sellers, in simple models, plain convex lenses set into wire or horn frames, kept in place by pinching the nose or by cords tied around the head. Comfortable they were not, but they did the job, and for many wearers it was the first time in decades that the world snapped into focus. Then, in 1450, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press changed the entire landscape. Books that had once been copied one at a time could now be produced by the 100, and later by the 1,000. As printed pages spread across Europe, demand for eyeglasses climbed with them. Literacy inched upward, and the need for corrected vision rose in step. Glasses ceased to be merely a scholar's aid and became a working tool of a brand new age of information. Manufacturing grew specialized. In Nuremberg, Germany, spectacle makers organized one of the first dedicated guilds by the late 15th century, while Venice and Florence emerged as centers of lens production, marrying advances in the clarity of glass to real skill in frame making. These early opticians ran no eye exams, but they offered a range of lenses of differing strengths, and customers picked their way through the options at the market stall until one suited them. The social meaning of glasses began to shift as well. At first they signaled learning and advancing age. Renaissance painters often placed spectacles on saints, scholars, and apostles as emblems of wisdom and inward focus. But as the middle class took them up, glasses came to stand instead for literacy, professionalism, and commercial shrewdness. They were no longer rare curiosities of the elite. They were turning into something far more revolutionary, useful, widespread, and, before long, indispensable. The 17th century brought a profound change in how people understood vision itself. It was no longer only a question of practicality. It had become a question of physics. This was the era of Galileo, of Kepler, and of Newton, men who not only turned their gaze toward the stars but also pried open the science of how light and lenses actually behave. Their findings transformed astronomy and optics alike, carrying eyeglasses across the line from folk remedy to scientific instrument. Kepler's work of 1604, his Ad Vitalianum Parallelopomena, laid the groundwork for modern optics. He was the first to explain how convex and concave lenses each corrected sight in their own way, drawing a clear distinction between myopia or nearsightedness and hyperopia or farsightedness. For the first time, a spectacle lens could be understood in terms of the precise bending of light rather than through trial and error. Galileo, in the meantime, fitted modified lenses together to build the first practical telescope, and others applied much the same logic to the microscope. The humble reading lens had become a means of exploring both the vastness of the heavens and the invisible world underfoot. The same glass that helped a person read a book now helped humanity read the stars and the living cell. This deeper grasp of optics filtered back to the people who ground the lenses. Armed with real knowledge of focal lengths and the curvature of glass, opticians began producing more precise corrective lenses, and the trade itself started to become a profession. Spectacle makers in London, Paris, and Amsterdam took to calling themselves opticians, a word rooted in science rather than mere craft. Frames improved by degrees too. Many were still bulky and pinched at the nose, but some now included leather pads to cushion the bridge, riveted hinges, or short handles known as temples, all early efforts to hold the glasses more securely in place. Where earlier glasses had helped chiefly the far-sighted, a widening understanding of visual disorders brought a broader range of remedies, so that for the first time a nearsighted young person could put on glasses and see clearly into the distance, carrying spectacles well beyond the elderly. And in China, spectacles with loops of silk cord tied behind the ears were already in use, and Europeans slowly borrowed the idea. Another great step forward was the spread of concave lenses for the nearsighted, the scholarly. By the close of the 1600s, eyeglasses had entered a new age. They were not merely functional, they were living proof of Enlightenment thinking, grounded in physics, driven by curiosity, and shaped by a literacy that kept on growing. From this point onward, the improvement of eyesight would be a matter of science rather than luck. By the 18th century, eyeglasses had not only grown more available, they had begun to grow fashionable. No longer confined to the scholar's desk or the tradesman's kit, spectacles found their way into salons, into royal courts, and into the coffee houses. The Enlightenment, with its love of reason and refinement, had produced a world in which intellect was in vogue, and so, quite naturally, were the objects that stood for it. The design of the frames themselves started to advance in striking ways. The clumsy nose-pinching devices of the medieval period gradually fell out of use. What replaced them were temple spectacles, eyeglasses fitted with arms that reached back over the ears, much like the frames worn in the present day. First appearing around the 720s, these sidearms gave glasses a stability and steadiness they had never possessed before, which mattered enormously for anyone who needed to wear them through an ordinary working day. Some had small hinges, others were shaped from pliable wire, and many were wrapped in silk or ribbon, partly for comfort against the skin and partly for a touch of decoration. The range of materials broadened as well. Craftsmen fashioned frames from tortoiseshell, horn, silver, and even gold. Those with money could order spectacles made to their own taste, finished with fine engraving or set with small jewels. Practical function still mattered a great deal, but appearance was beginning to catch up with it, and quickly. Prominent public figures did much to make eyeglasses ordinary rather than shameful. Benjamin Franklin, very likely the most famous spectacle wearer of the age, did more than simply put them on. He reinvented them. In the 1780s he devised the bifocal, taking two lenses ground for different distances, cutting each in half and setting them together within a single frame, so that he no longer had to trade one pair for another when he shifted his gaze from a page to the horizon. It was a modest, sensible solution to a daily annoyance, and its influence has lasted for centuries. In the same period, eyewear you could carry rather than wear grew fashionable. The quizzing glass, which was a single magnifying lens fixed to a short handle, became a favoured accessory among the well-to-do, particularly in Britain and France. People hung them from a chain worn around the neck and lifted them at parties and gatherings, often less to sharpen their sight than to signal wit, wealth, or a certain intellectual curiosity. Then came the lorgnette, a pair of lenses mounted on a handle rather than resting on the nose, especially popular among aristocratic women. It could be snapped open with a graceful flick and raised to the eyes to read a note or to watch a performance at the opera. For a great many owners, the point was never merely clear vision. It was to be noticed. By the 18th century, spectacles had come to stand for refinement, cleverness, and even a hint of flirtation. No longer a discreet admission of age or frailty, they had crossed over into the world of fashion. They framed a good deal more than a pair of eyes. They framed a person's whole sense of self. The 19th century carried spectacles down to the ordinary population. The Industrial Revolution delivered far more than steam engines and factory floors. It utterly reshaped how eyeglasses were manufactured, sold, and worn. What had once been handmade luxuries for a fortunate few turned into mass-produced necessities within reach of the many. Before industrial methods took hold, glasses were assembled one pair at a time by skilled hands. New machinery changed that, allowing lenses and frames to be turned out consistently and in large numbers. Cutting glass, shaping metal, and grinding lenses all became faster and more exact than any craftsman working alone could manage. The result was that a far greater share of people could both afford glasses and, at long last, see clearly. By the middle of the 1800s, eyeglasses could be bought in general stores and even ordered through mail-order catalogues. A visit to an optician was no longer required. Instead, customers would sample ready-made lenses on their own, trying one strength after another until they landed on a pair that seemed to help. This was a long way from tailored, professional eye care. Yet as a matter of plain access, it was an enormous stride forward. The variety of frame styles widened as well. Steel, nickel and celluloid, one of the earliest plastics, came into common use, taking the place of the prissia horn and tortoiseshell. The pince-nez, a style that clamped gently onto the bridge of the nose with no arms at all, found favour among scholars and stylish gentlemen alike. Round, wire-rimmed spectacles, the sort later made unforgettable by figures such as Gandhi and John Lennon, became a familiar sight on professionals and students. For the first time, eyewear made specifically for children reached the market. As public schooling spread and reading became widespread, so did the recognition that young eyes often needed help too. Teachers and parents slowly came to understand that a child who struggled to make out the blackboard or a printed page might not be lazy or inattentive at all. That child might simply be nearsighted. Medical knowledge of the eye advanced alongside these commercial changes. Ophthalmology took shape as a proper field of study, and the practice of testing sight began to grow more uniform. In 1862, the German ophthalmologist Hermann Snellen created the Snellen chart, that now familiar wall chart with its rows of letters shrinking line by line, and in doing so he transformed the way vision was measured and recorded. At the same time, wearing glasses in public grew steadily more acceptable. In earlier generations, many had concealed their need for spectacles out of embarrassment. During the 19th century, that feeling reversed itself, and a pair of glasses came to suggest seriousness, education, and the rising respectability of the middle class. Spectacles were useful, certainly, but they were also a mark of being professional and studious. By the close of the century, the world had grown clearer than at any point before it. Glasses had spread into classrooms, factories, courtrooms, and newsrooms. Sight itself had been industrialized, and for the first time in all of human history, vision had become something mass-marketed. When the 20th century arrived, eyeglasses were no longer only instruments of correction. They had become a genuine cultural force. This was the century in which vision met identity, in which fashion collided with science, and in which spectacles grew as individual and telling as a fingerprint. It was also the opening of a long technological contest in the field of optics, one that would come to shape modern eye care entirely. In the early 1900s, wire-rimmed frames held their popularity, especially among thinkers and professionals. Yet mass production kept advancing, and with it came fresh shapes, styles, and materials. By the 1920s and 1930s, celluloid and other plastics made bolder frames possible, giving rise to eyewear that was far more expressive. Thick black rims came to be linked with confidence and authority. Glasses were no longer something to tuck away. They were something to display. Hollywood played a decisive part in this shift. Performers such as Harold Lloyd, with his round, horn-rimmed frames, turned spectacles into a personal trademark. In later years, stars like Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, and Audrey Hepburn wore glasses both on and off the screen, choosing frames that underlined their character rather than concealing any weakness. During the Second World War, the pace of innovation quickened sharply. Military demand for superior optics drove improvements in the toughness of lenses, in anti-reflective coatings, and in lighter frame construction. The armed forces also issued standardized eyewear, known affectionately as GI glasses, and, rather less kindly, by another nickname among the soldiers who wore them. They were hardly flattering, but they were sturdy and readily available, which was the point. In 1958 came a major leap forward, the arrival of the plastic lens. Lighter and safer than glass, it changed the entire question of comfort. Paired with the development of photochromic lenses, which darken automatically in bright sunlight, glasses grew far more adaptable for everyday life. Then came contact lenses. Though the basic idea had been invented much earlier, It was only in the 1950s and 1960s that soft contacts became commercially practical. Suddenly there was a genuine choice. A person could wear glasses or choose not to. Meanwhile, fashion ran in every direction. The 1960s brought cat-eye frames and mod-inspired colours. The 1970s ushered in oversized aviators. The 1980s were the decade of big, unmistakable statements, the world of Run DMC and Wall Street executives alike. By the 1990s, a leaner minimalism returned, with rimless and thin wire frames ruling boardrooms and university halls together. Eyeglasses had become far more than aids to sight. They were declarations of politics, of intellect, of rebellion, of taste. Whether their wearer was a beat poet in Greenwich Village or a programmer in Silicon Valley, the glasses said something about the person behind them. The 20th century did not simply correct vision, it reframed the very meaning of it. The 21st century pushed eyeglasses into an entirely new territory, the digital one. As screens settled into every part of daily life, on our desks, in our pockets, even strapped to our wrists, our eyes began to pay for all that time spent staring. And so eyewear had to change once more. From a medical wonder to a fashion mainstay to a piece of high technology, glasses grew smarter, lighter, and more finely tailored to the individual than ever before. One of the most important shifts has been the rise of digital lens crafting. Where earlier eras molded lenses from a handful of preset prescriptions, modern glasses are shaped under the guidance of computers with remarkable precision. That precision permits lenses built to a person's exact eye measurements, the tilt of the head, the usual reading distance, and much more besides. Progressive lenses, which blend near, middle, and far vision into one smooth surface, have improved enormously, shedding the swimming distortions that troubled their earliest versions. Another advance has been blue light filtering technology. As people came to spend 8, 10, or even 12 hours a day looking at screens, reports of digital eye strain climbed sharply. Dry eyes, headaches, and blurred sight became a familiar complaint. Lens makers answered with coatings meant to screen out high-energy blue light, aiming to ease fatigue and, for some wearers, to improve sleep. Whether the underlying science is settled or not, the demand has climbed steadily. Frame technology moved ahead as well. Ultralight materials such as titanium, shape memory metal, and carbon fiber made glasses both tougher and more comfortable to wear. Some frames are now so slender and feather-light that the wearer forgets they are there at all. Others feature flexible hinges, hypoallergenic finishes, and modular parts that can be swapped and personalized. Then came smart glasses. Early experiments such as Google Glass had an uneven start, greeted with a mixture of wonder and public unease, yet the idea of augmented eyewear never truly went away. Newer versions fold in audio, built-in cameras, fitness tracking, and even small heads-up displays. Companies keep working to strike the right balance between usefulness and style, hoping to make smart glasses an everyday item people actually want to wear. The way eyewear is sold has shifted too. Online platforms now let a customer upload a photograph, try frames on virtually, and receive prescription lenses without ever setting foot in a shop. That widening of access, joined to sharp branding, has grown glasses into a thriving corner of e-commerce, and fashion has hardly faded. From round hipster frames to sleek minimalism to revived vintage looks, glasses today express identity more openly than they ever have. In the digital age, they do not only help a person see, they help them filter, protect, compute, and show precisely who they are. Looking ahead, the boundaries between technology, biology, and fashion keep dissolving into one another. We're entering an age in which simply correcting vision is only the starting point, an age in which glasses might extend what a human being can do, act as wearable computers, or perhaps in time vanish entirely. The point of the future is not only to see better, it is to see differently. One of the most promising frontiers is smart eyewear. Companies such as Meta, Apple, and Amazon are competing to build glasses that fold seamlessly into augmented reality. The aim is to lay digital information over the world in front of you, directions, notifications, translations, even three-dimensional objects, all without ever reaching for a phone. These devices hope to do for daily seeing what smartphones did for communication, making it instant, invisible, and immersive. At the same time, prescription lenses grow steadily more capable. Some firms are testing adaptive lenses that shift their focal length on their own, doing away with bifocals and with the habit of switching between pairs altogether. Using liquid crystal or electrochromic technology, such lenses can respond in real time to where the eye is looking, to the surrounding light, or to whatever the moment calls for. Medical science is also taking bold strides. Gene therapies and stem cell treatments for certain forms of blindness are showing genuine promise in early trials. Bionic eyes, once purely the stuff of science fiction, are already under development, with retinal implants and brain-computer interfaces striving to return partial sight to those who have lost it. Should these technologies mature, eyeglasses might one day become a transitional device, corrective tools eventually replaced by internal or neural solutions. Even so, the humble frame is not about to disappear. If anything, fashion keeps glasses relevant even as they grow more advanced. Designers are marrying tradition to futurism through 3D printed frames, recycled materials, modular builds, and colors chosen to order, all of which keep glasses personal and comfortable to wear. Virtual reality headsets, once bulky and awkward, are slimming down as well, borrowing freely from optical science to craft immersive worlds inside a sleeker, goggle-like form. In a sense, these devices are the spiritual successors of the lens. What began as a monk's reading aid in 13th century Italy has grown into a doorway to digital worlds, a medical marvel, and a lasting cultural icon. The story of eyeglasses was never only about helping us see the world more sharply. It is just as much about how the world has come to see us, and how that seeing keeps evolving, one lens at a time.